I'm Corrie Lynn Green, and this is Doug Fearn's take on music recording. Hello, Doug.
Hi, Corrie.
The last time we were together, we discussed studio technology for musicians. Doug Fearn took the time to ask me questions about my experience working in a music studio for the first time. We covered a lot of the basics about what I had learned. I thought it would be nice to turn those questions around and find out how Doug came into this knowledge of studio recording technology and to dig a little into his history surrounding the music business. So I have some questions for you, Doug, that I think people will be interested in. And I'm hoping we get both some technology questions in and some more personal questions about how you ended up with your own studio recording equipment and studio. I'm curious what your first memory around having interest in sound recording is.
I think I was fascinated by it because of my exposure with my father with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Even though I was not allowed to be at any of the recording sessions, they would do a couple times a year television performances on one of the local Philadelphia stations. It's not quite the same as recording, but there's a lot of similarities. And I was allowed to be there for that. And I was just fascinated by all the equipment and the microphones and all the stuff that was set up. But I don't think I really thought of myself as experimenting with recording until, I guess, when I was maybe 13, I discovered this tape recorder that somebody had thrown out, a home tape recorder, not a professional recorder. And I brought it home and fixed it up, made it work. And that was the beginning of my fascination with recorded sound. I didn't have any music to record at that time, but, I learned that technology. And then it was at my high school, which had its own FM broadcast station, which is very unusual. They had professional equipment. They had Ampex tape machines and, RCA mics and stuff. So it gave me an opportunity to actually do some real recording. First experience trying to record the school orchestra was just a disaster. It just sounded so awful. And I just thought, I'm never going to figure out how to do this until I realized that the primary problem was, the school's cinder block auditorium. And with nothing in it, wooden seats, no padding, no carpeting, nothing. The room was just awful sounding. And as I experimented with how can I place mics to pick up this orchestra that doesn't pick up so much of the room that it, sort of ruins the experience, I think that's how I really got into it. And then I had friends in high school who were in bands. They wrote some of their own songs, but mostly they were doing cover versions of songs that they liked. Rolling Stones, Beach Boys, whatever, all kinds of stuff. So they asked me if I would record their band. And my music exposure up to that point didn't include much popular music at all. I was totally unfamiliar with the songs that they were going to be performing. And they gave me records of, the real performers doing this. And I said, I don't know if I can do this. This is just like, I don't understand this at all. And they said, well, let's just give it a try. And we did. And in one day, I learned so much. And it's kind of ironic because a lot of the techniques that I sort of figured out on the fly that day are the things I've been doing ever since. Like the single ribbon mic in front of the drums.
Right.
Things like that. So that was my introduction, and that really got me interested in doing it. And by that point, I concluded that that's what I wanted to do.
You had a really clear vision at a really young age. I wonder back then if orchestra music really moved you. Was the music the thing that moved you, or was the technology itself the thing that you found yourself really curious about?
Well, it's always been this way. They're equal. In fact, if anything, over the years, I've come to see the technology is just tools you have to use. So my focus has, over the years, shifted more on the music rather than on the technology, because I've got that figured out. I know what I need to do to get what I want. And although, I'm always trying new things, it may have started out equal, but it's become much more of a focus on the music.
When you were learning this technology and recording more popular albums or sounds with your friends, did you have a favorite popular album back then?
That's a good question.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of funny. I think the pop group that really caught my attention the first time was the Mamas and Papas.
Yeah.
And ironically, decades later, I would end up working with both of the women from that
Oh, wow.
that group, in very minor situations. But, it was like there was just something about those recordings. They were so well done, and their producer just knew exactly what to do to make them sound right. And I just thought, this is about as good as it gets. So that was my first introduction. And then it was the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album that really convinced me there's nothing else I wanted to do.
I think so many people would agree with that choice. And I know that recording something like that must have been a feat. And when I listen to the Beatles albums, even today, I don't know that it can really be beat in any way. So it just keeps growing and getting more interesting. And the more I learn about music, the more I understand how talented they really were.
Oh, they were. And, George Martin was just a brilliant producer. And the studio, of course, Abbey Road, was fabulous.
Yes.
And I never got to work with George Martin, but I did work at Abbey Road Studios.
Wow.
For a project. So that was pretty interesting.
I bet. And
Yeah.
just historical, right?
Yeah.
What was your first job in the music industry?
Well, I don't know if it really qualifies as a music industry, but I started out in radio because I had that experience at my high school radio station. I had the first-class radio telephone license that you had to have to get a job as an engineer at a radio station back in those days. And I was looking for a summer job. And I went to all the Philadelphia radio stations because back then everybody took their vacations in the summer. And so they would hire people for the whole summer. And they always had trouble finding qualified people. So I went in and I just cold called all these stations, everything you shouldn't do.
Right.
But I got interviews at every one of them. And ultimately, every one of them offered me the summer job. But I picked WPEN because every time I went to one of these places to apply for the job, I said, can you give me a tour? Because I wanted to see the place.
Yes.
I had never really been in another radio station except my high school station, at that point. So I just decided WPEN was it because it was old-time radio, with 11 studios and
Wow.
and one giant studio that took up the whole first floor, which originally was used for a teenage dance afternoon program, which eventually evolved into American Bandstand.
So everything was happening live on
Live.
the air of these studios.
Yeah. One of the studios upstairs was all set up with a grand piano and an organ and room for lots of musicians because back in those days you did a lot of live music on the radio.
I love that.
Yeah, and it was just so much fun. I just really enjoyed it. Now, it had changed a lot by the time I got there, but it was still a fascinating experience. And I ended up being there for several years because they they kept trying to talk me into a full-time job. And I kept saying, no, I'm in high school, you know. But eventually, you know, at that point, I realized I knew what I wanted to do. I knew the only way I was going to accomplish that would be to make enough money to buy the equipment to build a studio. And, you know, back then, the equipment was incredibly expensive. There was no sort of entry-level or semi-pro stuff. So I had to find a way to make that money. And the radio station paid very, very well. And I figured this is a great situation where I can learn a lot more. I enjoy what I'm doing here because back then the engineers ran the programming, you know, basically.
Okay, so you got to choose what was going to be played.
Well, not that.
Okay.
That was all. There was a record librarian that picked the disc jockeys didn't get to choose it either.
Okay.
Which is sort of the same way it is today, only a computer chooses it, but it's the same process. But you ran the turntables, you ran the tape machines, you played the commercials. Basically, all the guy on the other side in the studio, you know, you're in the control room, the guy in the studio talked. You turned on his mic and pointed to him when it was time for him to talk. It was really good practice for interacting with people in a music recording situation because you had to, it's a cooperative thing, you know, you had to work together. So I, you know, sort of learned how to do that pretty well from that experience. And it gave me the money to build a studio.
Did you have a mentor when you were working there, someone who was encouraging you to go further, or were you really self-sufficient in that way and knew what you wanted and knew how to get there?
No, I didn't have anybody. And, you know, I was the first new engineer they had there since 1947.
Oh, my goodness.
So here I am, 17 years old, you know.
Wow.
And working with all these old guys, including guys who were there when the station went on the air in the 1920s. And, you know, they knew so much about how this whole thing, they invented radio, basically. Right. But I could not get them to talk. It was just, I was so frustrated because I really wanted to know about what that was like back then. What was it like when nobody had ever done this before and you had to figure out how to make it work, you know? So, but I had a really hard time getting any information. I've always been best just learning on my own. And I considered at one point, you know, see if I could get like an internship at a big studio and learning there. But I came to the conclusion that I could probably learn faster on my own, because it's one thing when somebody's there telling you this is how we do it. It's another when you say, I wonder if this will work.
Yeah, you learn a lot quicker.
Yeah, for me, that's the way I learned. The path was obvious to me. I mean, I never even gave it any real conscious thought. It just seemed inevitable. This is what I was going to do.
How long did you work for the station before you started to build your first studio?
Oh, almost right away. But the problem was back then you had to be 21 to do anything.
Okay.
You couldn't start a business. You couldn't rent an apartment.
Wow.
You couldn't vote. You know, it's like you were a kid until you were 21. You weren't allowed to do any of that stuff. So I did a lot of recording on location, all kinds of stuff. Not really in business, but getting paid for it a little bit here and there. But that was all the lead up to when I was 21, when I could start a real company and rent the space for my first studio.
So you were just biding your time, and then you turned 21 and you did it.
Well, I had everything lined up so that, you know, my birthday was in March. April 3rd, the company was incorporated. I had already lined up the building and told them, you know, rent starts in April. So I was ready to go.
What was your first big job at that studio?
Well, you know, it started out really small because I wasn't really well equipped. The place wasn't totally done. And so I was just doing things with some of the things with the kids that I worked with in high school. They would come in and we would just experiment. I wasn't charging them for the time or anything. But to be competitive, I just needed so much equipment that, it was just so hard for me. I was making a lot of money and I lived very, very frugally. So I just put it all into that facility. What was the first big job? I don't even remember, to tell you the truth.
It was just work and you were going to do it. And like so many people starting out in this industry, I do think it takes time to build that equipment and there's a cost to it. So little by little, and you're learning all along that way, right? I mean, with every mistake you make or every new piece of equipment that makes things better.
Well, when I started out, I had two-track tape machines, and that was it, which really limits what you can do. But I needed a multi-track machine. But at that point, 4-track recording was already obsolescent, and everybody had moved to 8-track. Most studios had moved to 8-track recording. But I couldn't afford that machine, so I had to find a way to get a 4-track machine. And my girlfriend at the time's mother, I spent a lot of time at their house. She really liked feeding me and talking to me. And I was telling her about this dilemma that I had, and she says, well, I'll lend you the money. And I thought, no, I can't do that. She was a single mom and worked all the time, and I just would feel terrible about taking $5,000 from her to buy a tape machine. So the matter was like unsettled in my mind until one day I walk in there and she hands me a check for $5,000.
Wow.
Which I paid back pretty quickly, but, it was the important step that I needed to get that 4-track machine, which made the studio viable. But all the rest of that was the only new piece of gear I had, I think. Everything, well, some mics were new. It was all stuff I had scrounged. Among that were all these old, mostly RCA microphone preamplifiers that were all tubes from the 30s and 40s, most of them. I couldn't wait to get rid of them. But when I finally got a big solid-state console, I just said, what happened to this sound? It just does not sound right to me anymore. And, I sort of reluctantly dragged into the solid-state era of equipment, but I never liked it, which, comes into the picture much later.
It can come into the picture right now as my next question is, how did this job evolve you into wanting to create your own sound recording equipment? So some of the answer was there. How did you do it?
There's a lot of interim steps here, but to jump ahead to this, I have been doing location recording and mostly classical or choral stuff or chamber orchestras or things like that. And I just really wasn't happy with the sound of it. And I thought, what is it about those old recordings that sounded so much better to me? And I came to the realization it was those vacuum tube mic preamps. By that point, they were, ancient history. You couldn't even find one, I don't think. So I decided, well, maybe I'll build one. And it was mainly for my own use. I sort of had in the back of my mind that it could be a product. It really wasn't my goal at that stage. Several things led up to me deciding that maybe this would be a business. It took me a while to develop this mic preamp to the point where I liked it, which is still the basis of all the mic preamps we made. I mean, that design that I did in the early 90s has not changed at all. And designed for the way I hear things. And you're hearing it right now.
Yeah, right.
And some friends of mine in the studio business in Philadelphia area and beyond who were curious about what I was doing and wanted to try out this mic preamp. And I lent it to a couple people, and they didn't want to give it back. So I thought, okay, maybe there's a market here for this. So that was the beginning of that. There was also sort of an incentive because I had been working so long in this abstract area of recording where there's not really a tangible product. I mean, eventually there might be an album or a CD, but it wasn't the same. It was I was sort of fascinated by the idea of building stuff, and it was completed, tested, shipped out to somebody. There was just something about that process that was like a new direction for me that appealed to me.
Seems like it would take a certain kind of brain too. Like I know that you love technology, and I know that you could take a radio apart and put it back together when you were young, and I know that you're a pilot. Do you think that it takes a certain kind of thinker to have the ability to create something like this and understand the technology? Or was it just a matter of understanding the old equipment and finding a way to put it back together and create something new?
Well, I mean, all technology is just a tool,
Yeah.
And for me, I needed that tool.
Yeah.
And just from my experience, through my life up to that point, I understood how all that stuff worked.
Mm-hmm.
To a certain extent, in my younger years, I was like really fascinated by it. And to some extent, I still am. But to me, it was just part of what I did.
A means to an end.
Yeah. But I mean, I understood it in a way that didn't require a whole lot of effort, which isn't to say developing a product like that is easy. But I think the important thing in any kind of design, no matter what it is you're designing, you could be designing a song, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a sense of what the end product you want is before you start, or which may change along the way as you explore it. But I've always started with, what do I want this to do? And then how do I make it do that?
Mm.
I mean, I think back in the early days of personal computers, even before like the IBM PC, which is the basis of most of the computers everybody uses, with the Apple computers that wouldn't do anything unless you wrote a program to make it do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not like the most fascinating thing in the world to me, but I saw applications that I could use it to do. But what I would do, which is probably, I don't know how programmers work, but I would envision using the program and saying, what do I want the screen to look like? What questions does it need to ask and be answered? And what input does it need? And then work backwards to what is the code to make that work.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same way I do any technology.
When this began, this technology wasn't being used and you started to recreate it. Has it become more popular now in time using this kind of equipment? Are people now creating it? Or are you still standing alone in your company?
Well, there have been a few companies who were building vacuum tube gear. And when I started, there was not a whole lot of competition. I'm not sure what the statistics are today, but a few years ago, and I don't think it's changed much, it was over 90% of records used at least some vacuum tube equipment in the recording of that album or single or song or whatever. For the people that are making the music and recording it, vacuum tubes have always been there. They never really went away.
Okay.
They sort of lost a lot of popularity in the 70s and 80s. And then I think in the 90s somewhat, and then in the 2000s, I think people started to really appreciate that difference. So I just happened to be there, at the right time when people suddenly said, this really sounds good,
Yeah.
I want that. So there are a few more manufacturers that make vacuum tube-based equipment now. And, I know all of them. They're all my friends because
Right.
It's a really tiny business.
Sure.
And who else do we have to talk to except each other because nobody else would have
That's
a
right.
clue about what we were talking about. I've really enjoyed that part of it.
Well, since I'm a creative artist and not so much interested in the technology of things, although that is changing as I get to know you more, One thing that I think is special about your equipment is it's aesthetically really different than other equipment I've seen. Will you talk a little bit about what it looks like and how you made the decision to make it look that way?
Well, I think the full explanation of that goes back to when I was 14 with my first business. And a friend that I met through amateur radio had a printing press in his basement that he had used. I mean, he was a hobbyist who like had a million hobbies, and this was just one of them. And I was always fascinated by that. And one day he says, "Do you want it?" And he gave me this printing press and all these, probably a dozen typefaces and metal tape. You had metal type you had to hand set. And I came to realize at that point that, yeah, you could just set the type and print something and, looks okay. Or you could put a little more effort into it and make it look nice, by picking the right fonts and doing things with that composition to make it look better. And I think that's where I started to develop sort of a sense of what looks good. Plus looking at other equipment and saying, that's a nice design.
Yeah.
It's functional. Everything you need is logical. It looks like it would be easy to use. And it's beautiful. It's well designed. And so that was sort of my inspiration. So I knew that the products I designed had to have that same sort of aesthetic quality, because I thought, if this is going to be the best stuff in the world, which I hoped it would be,
Yes.
It has to look the part.
Yeah.
It shouldn't look junky.
Yeah.
And I know what it's like to be in a busy session and work with a box with a bunch of little knobs on it, half of which, you've never had occasion to use, and make it so that it's simple, intuitive, does what the engineer wants. You get the sound you want real quickly, and make it really difficult to make it sound bad.
Yes. Great.
And when I first built a, sort of finished prototype, I thought I'd better paint the front panel, because all the prototypes up to that point had just been shiny aluminum panels, and that was not the look I wanted at all. So I went to the hardware store to buy some paint, spray paint, to paint this thing. And my thought was to use this sort of blue-gray color paint.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a little out of the ordinary for studio equipment, most of which was either black. Or aluminum.
Right.
But as I have this can of gray, blue spray paint in my hand, there's like this color over off to my right of red that I said, I really like that color. I said, it may not be the final thing, but I'm going to paint this one with that red color. And people really responded to that, because at that point, nobody that I know of had ever made a piece of equipment for a recording studio that was red.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some now since then, but sort of because I just liked the look of it.
Yeah.
It also seemed to make the product attention-grabbing.
Definitely.
Those are the kinds of things that went into sort of the aesthetic part of the product design.
So that's a lot about the technology and how you got here. I have a few more questions if you're willing to answer them.
Sure.
I'm curious a little bit, as you're producing more music inside the studio itself. Has being producing inside the music industry changed how you listen to music? Do you enjoy listening to music? Is there a certain type of music that you're most attracted to? Or are you always kind of on when you're listening to music?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's just probably, my answer is probably going to make some people mad. In my younger days, I listened to everything. I studied it. I listened over and over and over to those albums that were so influential on me, and most of those on everybody back in those days. At some point in your career, no matter what you're doing, I think, at least for me, you reach a point where studying stuff, reading about it, listening to what other people are doing, all that just is no longer beneficial, because by that point you've gained as much from that as you're ever going to get. And the important thing at that stage is to just do it. Stop studying, go out and do it. And so I would say by the early 1980s, I basically stopped listening to anything. And, do I not listen to any music ever? No, because every once in a while I just say, oh, it would be really nice to hear that.
Yeah.
And I'll put it on, I'll listen to one song, and I'll say, okay, good. That does the job. Now I can get back to work. But what I do listen to is whatever I'm working on. And that's all I listen to during the project is what I'm working on. To me, this sounds awful saying it, but I like the way my stuff sounds better than anything else. What can you say?
That's good.
Yeah.
That's the way it should be, I think.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself, how do you keep yourself objective when you're listening for the things that need to change? Are they apparent right away? How many listens does it take for you to decide what needs to change, or where things need to grow, or where you'd like to put certain sounds? How do you make those decisions? Is it just intuitive, or is there a process that you go through when you're listening? How long does it take?
Now, I always tell people the music tells you what it needs.
Yeah.
And I really believe that. When I listen to something, for example, a demo of your song, a new song, I'll just say, man, what would sound good in this? And it usually just comes to me almost instantly.
Very intuitive.
Yeah. But there are other times when we'll be well into that song, and I'll say, oh, you know what? Why don't we try this? And unfortunately, because of the way you and I have to work with such limited time together, we can't always explore those things as deeply as we'd like to.
Right.
That, to me, is the exciting part. I mean, I think throughout my recording career, I always wanted to experiment with something, I used to tell people, and this was basically based on songs, but I think it has to do with recording as well. I would always say, play me something I haven't heard before.
Yeah.
I really need that novelty.
Yeah.
So when I'm listening to something that we're working on, I will want to say, well, how far can we go with this? What kind of thing can we do with this that's it's perfectly serving the music, and yet is something different?
I love that approach. If someone is interested in becoming a recording artist, or even on the producer side, what qualities are you looking for in someone who is bringing their artistry to you? Is it perfection? Is it a certain kind of voice? Is it a style of playing? Or does it just become like one big thing that you hear and
Yeah, I would say in almost every case, when somebody sends me something, and they don't do this as much as I used to get, which, is good and bad. But as soon as I hear it, I know this is somebody I want to work with, or, heard it before, or, nice song, but, it's still not reaching me somehow. So it has to appeal to me personally.
Yeah.
I just, at this stage in my career, I don't want to work on stuff that I don't like. I've done enough of that.
Yeah. Now you get to choose.
Right.
And in making that choice, is there something you gravitate toward? Or it's just a sound and you know it?
Yeah. Well, I think using you as an example, when I first heard the song that you recorded, it was on YouTube, it was like, oh, this is a great song. And I love her voice. And this is something like I've never heard before. I mean, it had a lot of components that I had heard before, but it was just this combination of things. And maybe really critical, too, is I know how to make that sound a whole lot better.
Yeah, I think, and I certainly don't fit into that perfect pitch category. So it's really interesting to kind of get picked up and learn more about that. But also there's a quality to my voice that's unusual and outside of the box. So it's something that someone with, the right ear would have to hear and be interested in investing in, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is true with anybody I'm producing, they have to be somebody that has authority in their voice. It's like when they're telling you a story, you have to believe it.
Yeah.
If you can't believe their story, if it doesn't reach you emotionally,
Yes.
it's not going to reach the listener either.
Yeah.
So it has to have that component as well.
Yeah, that's a really important part.
Yeah.
Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I want to ask you one more question for people who are out there who are working at this in some way, and maybe they're working on the technology side and they'd like to somehow get into the music industry, or maybe they're like me and they're working on being an artist or singing, or they'd like to record an album. What advice could you give people on some first steps that they could take to get themselves moving, motivated, or at least aimed in the right direction for that to occur?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there's no formula for that. And one of the key factors is you have to have a range of talents. That can be, first of all, your musical talent, your storytelling talent, or whatever it is in your music that's important for people to relate to. I mean, music is an emotional thing.
Yeah.
So you got to make sure that you can reach the people. Some of the things we already talked about, like you've got to have authority. The people pay attention. You demand attention.
Yeah.
And then you just really need to work on it, because nobody's born knowing how to do this.
Yeah.
They have to learn. And it's a lot of work.
Yes.
And it's a giant commitment. We used to have a saying back in my studio when we'd get somebody in. We did a lot of record company business with big artists and stuff like that. But there's also all these people that thought that they could be, the next big thing, which I think is a great attitude. You got to start out, with ambition. But, it was obvious that their chances were very, very slim. And we used to always say, it's nice to have hobbies.
Yeah.
And I think that sounds condescending, but the point is, I think for a lot of people, just doing music for fun is what they need and what they should be doing.
Yeah, and I even had a realization like that recently, which was, we've made this amazing studio album, which we put out at the end of May, and it was an incredible experience. And then we're moving into the next steps of what we're going to do now. And I had this realization of now we're just going to get to make music. Now we're just going to go make another single, and we're just going to go make another song, and nothing else has to happen except the enjoyment of creating that and doing our very best and putting the very best spin we have on those songs that we've written. And it's the creating itself, whether you end up in the spotlight or whether you're never heard, you have to have joy in it because it is a lot of work. So you better love what you're doing and put your energy just toward the experience itself and stay in the present moment.
Yeah, that's all true. I agree. And, one other talent that you have to have, and this is where most people get tripped up, is you have to have the talent to make things happen, which means, you can't just record the thing and then wait for the world to discover you.
Right.
And that's just one example.
Yes.
But there's 1,000 of things like that. Like, who's going to back you up if you're performing, And,
yes.
How are you going to get your music out to people? Who's going to carry this music? Is it going to be on a streaming service? You're going to do a CD? What's the plan? And then make it happen.
Yeah.
And I've just seen so many people that were incredibly talented that I just loved their music. And I thought they had everything going for them, but they lacked that one ability to make it happen. You know, people around them can certainly help facilitate that, but it really comes down to you, the artist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and all this applies to somebody that wants to be an engineer or a producer.
Yep.
It's all the same process. It's just different angles on the same thing.
Yeah.
When I run into somebody that I can just see is driven and is ambitious and is talented and wants to do it, whether they want to be an engineer, a producer, a mixer, you know, a mastering engineer, whatever it is, you know it right away.
Yeah.
They're going to do it.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of people that say, great talent, I just don't know whether they're ever going to have any real success.
Right. Wow. So true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So be motivated.
Right. Well, you have to have that drive. It's just part of
Yep.
what makes it work.
Yep.
And going back to the hobby aspect of it, some of the musicians I know that have the most fun making music have basically zero ambition.
Right.
They just like making music,
Yes.
either by themselves or with friends or whatever. And a lot of times I think they're just a lot happier.
Yeah, that is
'Cause they-
okay.
Yeah, because they don't have that pressure on
Yep.
them. They're not putting that pressure on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's totally valid.
Yeah.
You know, make the music you want to make the way you want to make it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. I really liked exploring both the history of where you're coming from and how you got involved in technology, but also the more personal side of how you ended up here and your history with music in general.
Well, thanks. I think you asked great questions.
Great.
And we should tell people that we didn't prepare for well, you did, but
little.
I had no idea
He
what
had
the
no
question-
idea what these questions were going to be. And so I kind of like the spontaneity of that too.
Yeah,
and,
me too.
And a lot of the questions I asked ended up being a little spontaneous as well as I listened to these great answers. So I think it's going to be a good value. It's a good value for me. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you.
This is Doug Fearn's take on music recording. I'm Corrie Lynn Green, and Doug will be back for the next episode. Stay tuned.